Alright, welcome back to another reaction video. Today we're taking a look at History Matters' newest video, Why Did France Halt Its Invasion of Germany in 1939? Now, pretty much everybody's going to know how or why France is at war with Germany in 1939. Start of World War II, the German invasion of Poland in September of that year. But what a lot of people tend to forget or not know in the first place is that beyond the Sitzkrieg, the sitting war, or this period where the French and Germans just kind of were in a standoff back and forth in the 1940 prior to the invasion of France itself, there is a brief moment where French troops invade and move into Germany proper before retreating and pulling back into France and maintaining the defensive line. I'm curious to see where this goes. I'm curious to see what he says. I have a few assumptions off the bat. Uh, One, maybe it's to shore up and make sure that lines are secure and prevent any kind of salient that could be taken advantage of by the Germans. That would be an assumption. Uh, there may have been a theoretical, hey, let's not escalate too much further, especially before we can get British troops on the ground here as well. And we'll move on with that. Let's actually see what he has to say, and let's see where we are going with this video specifically.
During the early days of the Second World War in Europe, as Germany was invading Poland, France was faced with a somewhat sparsely defended German border. On September the 7th, 6 days after the France was faced with a somewhat sparsely defended German.
And I think this is a great kind of moment to take a look at how this border is actually shaped and the kind of oddly short border when you consider the fact that the early days of World War II and pretty much the entirety of World War I were extremely long fronts between primarily French and German forces versus at least at the beginning. But you'll see the actual German-French border is fairly short, relatively speaking. We have Luxembourg, very, very small in here, but primarily Belgium in the northwest, as along this route. That's why these areas become incredibly important when it actually comes to the German invasion, both during World War I and World War II. But they've got the bulk of their forces out east. They've got to commit a fairly decently sized force into Czechoslovakia to maintain control in the region after its conquest. And they have to be prepared and put most of their troops in Poland to face off with their military. We're 5 seconds in, I'm already talking about stuff.
German border. On September the 7th, 6 days after the start of the war, the French army advanced into Germany. What's notable about this is that the French didn't advance very far. Not because of German resistance, but because the French weren't really feeling it. But given that most of Berlin's forces were occupied in Poland, why didn't the French take advantage and launch a major offensive into Germany proper? So as you may know, during the interwar period, France had a very close military
That's a very good question.
relationship with Poland. The French had sent military observers and advisors there during the Polish-Soviet War, and shortly afterwards the two entered a formal alliance. This alliance was mostly on paper until Germany's new leader started to change the borders around his country, meaning that both of them now wanted to get serious. As a result of this,
and remember, up to this point, there has been a lot of appeasement. This idea that, well, they can take a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more, as long as it doesn't spark this broader, more destructive conflict, especially with the memory of World War I so freshly in the minds of many, many individuals. A ton of people who are in government, who are making decisions in France, in England, in Poland, in Germany, dealt with or fought in the First World War. So a lot of these individuals are trying to avoid any kind of repeat or recreation of that conflict. So there's a big push to, well, maybe if we give him a few things, they'll stop. Uh, there's a few other pieces with that. Realistically, France and England also didn't trust Hitler. They were trying to build up their own supplies, their own militaries in the meantime while they were doing this appeasement strategy. They just failed to ramp up at the same rate that the Germans had been throughout this period, which ends up causing problems. You have the Rhineland being reoccupied by the German military. You have Anschluss, the taking of Austria in addition of it to Germany. You have the Munich conference that ends up giving the Sudetenland, and then the eventual actual German invasion of Czechoslovakia. And now at this point, Germany is committing huge numbers of troops to their eastern front against Poland, because at this point, all evidence continues to show that the Allies aren't going to do squat. They're going to just let them steamroll this. So it becomes kind of surprising when the French step in, but I am curious to see where we go on from this, because that could have really changed up the game here if the French got a decent push into Germany during this period.
The two nations came up with a plan on how to defeat Germany in the event of war. They knew Germany wouldn't want to fight a two-front war again, and so assumed that it would try to concentrate on Poland first. And the French promised that so long as the Polish held out for 3 weeks, they would be able to launch a massive invasion of Germany to relieve Warsaw. Sounds pretty good, but when the time came, the major offensive never materialised.
Nope.
So why? Well, there were several important reasons. The first was that whilst the French were able to cross the border within days of Germany's invasion of Poland, it wasn't able to build up its forces anywhere near quick enough to quickly launch an offensive at any meaningful scale. The French army that crossed into the Saarland was only about a quarter of the size that the French military chiefs had promised the Polish. You see, conscription wasn't a very fast process, and transporting hundreds of thousands of soldiers and the equipment to go with them wasn't something that you could do within a week.
Yeah, logistical restraints are always going to be a major problem for militaries. And it is smart, if you think that it's going to be a protracted war, to hold those back and make sure that you can get the logistics in place. And we've seen that prior to the beginning of World War II in the efforts of the French, the building of the Maginot Line, this long series of fortifications that hopefully will prevent a German invasion. Although there's also arguably the reality that there are trying to reforce the Germans to do their same World War I strategy where they invaded through Belgium, and then they could catch them in that gap, that smaller territory. Now, of course, that's going to end up backfiring later on because the Germans are going to punch through the Ardennes where they aren't expected and encircle those Allied troops along the Belgian border and eventually force them back to Dunkirk. Thankfully, they end up evacuating a huge number of troops from Dunkirk, but those logistics are an important necessity for any prolonged effort. And the French have not managed or not successfully rallied and prepped like they should have or could have during the 3 years since the initial... Oh goodness, is it 3 years? What year did the Germans reoccupy the Rhineland? Oh, it is 1936. Okay. I just wanted to double check that. But yeah, they could have used those 3 years to a huge advancement in rebuilding the military, prepping it, and getting it ready for a larger conflict, which, again, they kind of did on the defensive side, but they have not properly prepped for an invasion of Germany, which makes any prolonged push into the country incredibly difficult.
Of course, there were many more troops manning the border at the famous Maginot Line, but the French didn't want to move them. The reason being that France's military leadership believed that this war would be much like the last. with static defences reigning supreme and offensive action being far too costly to consider, which is why the troops within this small offensive were tasked with simply probing the German defences and taking already abandoned towns and villages. There was a hope that the British would be able to move enough troops into France to relieve some of the French troops manning the border of Belgium, who would then be moved down south to help with the offensive. But that didn't happen because Britain hadn't finished rearming yet, and supplying the soldiers it was already drip feeding into France was difficult enough.
Very, very subtle having an individual who's under-prepped just show up in their underwear. But, yeah, that makes a lot of sense too. One of the big ideas of appeasement was that they'd be able to rearm. But neither country manages to do it at a level that they really needed to eventually counter the impact of the Germans. And that makes this an incredibly hard gambit or idea. When the British show up, there's not enough men and there's not enough equipment to realistically shuffle things around enough to launch a full-scale invasion of Germany. And this is where we are still in this Sitzkrieg, this sitting war of just kind of looking at each other and waiting for somebody to make a move.
The second reason that the invasion was halted was that French politicians were worried about selling the idea of a major offensive war on behalf of Poland to the French populace. France's governments were, to put it mildly, quite fragile during this period, and those in government were fearful that pushing too far too quickly would lead to panic and unrest across the country. If the French were to mostly stay put, when Germany inevitably crossed the border into France or maybe that Belgian place, it would help to unite the nation and quell political dissent. Also, the French argued that the alliance with Poland said that France was simply obliged to invade Germany, which of course it had just done, and therefore it had kept its word.
Which, bad logic. But, going back to the previous logic, it does make a lot of sense to be concerned with the structural longevity of the nation. The Great Depression was, well, France wasn't hit as bad as some other countries. I mean, it's still not a good time. France was more self-sufficient than some other ones and therefore prevented some of the worst impacts of the Great Depression. But the actual government inside of France was pretty consistently changing. And the public was pretty much never happy with them. The lack of a consistent government entity prevented any real long-term relief efforts because each new government had new plans, new ideas, new concepts, and they tended to be so short-lived that none of them really got off the ground to start changing things. So by the time that the Germans invade Poland and we see the sparking of this war, they're concerned that a major offensive war, one where they invade Germany, one where they are more the aggressors. The Germans are the aggressors. They invaded Poland. But they are taking the active role of moving into a foreign state. That's a much harder sell for a lot of people. Especially when the government is fragile and barely functional.
This is an assessment that the Polish would not agree on. The third reason was that the French had expected the Polish to be able to hold out for much longer. The initial plan was that Poland would resist Germany effectively for many months, which would drain German resources and allow France the time to prepare.
Now, to be fair, the Polish were starting to build a strong western line, one that theoretically could have held back the Germans longer. The problem is the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the deals that came alongside it that gave Eastern Poland to the Soviet Union, and the Soviets eventually invading Poland crushes what's left of a possible reassessment or rebuilding of the lines. And as a result, the Polish get basically steamrolled in a very short period of time. It's not this months-long slog that the French want the Polish to have to deal with the Germans, because that would keep the Germans held there longer in time for them to prep and better maneuver for a larger invasion.
As you'll know, this didn't happen, and many French generals were genuinely shocked at how quickly Poland was being overrun. To them, this meant it wouldn't be long until the Germans could then move troops westward, and then the French troops in Germany would be caught way beyond the safety of the literally invincible Maginot Line. The speed of Poland's fall was compounded when the USSR joined Germany and invaded Poland from the east.
Yep.
As a result, some were worried that if France were to advance to the point of potentially knocking Germany out of the war, the Soviets would then get involved, fearing that their gains in Poland would be at risk. And since nobody wanted that, it was better to just look like you were doing something. And the fourth reason was simple. The French had no idea how much weaker the German army on the border was than their own. If the French had mounted the invasion of the size that they had initially planned, they almost certainly would have overwhelmed the German border defences. At which point, the French would have had access to open country and the unguarded industrial heartlands of Germany. But their own assessment was that German defences were fierce and well manned, believing that German leadership would never take such a foolish risk. When in fact, they had, and much of the army defending the border had been hollowed out to provide extra manpower to the offensive in the east.
Which they needed. Poland would not have been nearly as quickly overrun or destroyed without the additional manpower that was pulled off of the western line. Right? Basically, it was a gamble. And that's a big part of why we don't see a major offensive from the Germans until 1940. It's because of the fact that they are so focused on knocking Poland out of the war and then immediately moving west. In a lot of ways, this is a reflection of and a better executed version of the planning that came from the first part of the war, of World War I, almost in reverse. In World War I, Germany had two primary enemies. Russia in the east, France in the west. They saw Russia as the biggest threat during that period, but they thought that they would be slow to mobilize or prepare, whereas France, problem, but could be dealt with relatively quickly with a capture of Paris, kind of like they'd done back in the Franco-Prussian War, or deal with them, knock them out, and now we can move back east. Well, in this case, Poland is the weaker of the two nations. They think that it'll be easier to knock Poland out, especially with the assistance of the Soviets, and then that will secure their eastern border and prevent a long-term two-front war, allowing them to move troops back to France for the proper invasion. And it works. Knock out Poland, they rearrange things, they invade France, and in a series of very potent maneuvers, managed to knock the French out in a very short period of time once the actual offensive begins.
Because Berlin was willing to gamble that the French didn't have the stomach for such an aggressive move, which of course it turns out, they did not. I hope you enjoyed this episode with
another great video from History Matters. I very much so enjoyed it. I hope you guys did too. We will see you in the next video when we take a look at something else. Really quick, shout out to Nate Perkins who suggested Kings and Generals before. Nate, I just did want to bring up someone. I realize now why a lot of people don't react to Kings and Generals, and that is the fact that they, a lot of stuff is copyrighted with their videos. I'm going to leave the last one up, but I don't think I'm going to do another reaction just because of that, just because of those copyrights and the theoretical problems that they might bring along in the future. But thank you guys for watching. See you in the next one. Have a great day. Bye.